Hello from Intellipaat guys. Today we're going to be going over a simple login form using Python Flask with MongoDB as the database. But before we actually begin, be sure to hit that subscribe button and click on that bell notification icon so you don't miss out on any updates from us. Firstly, we're going to be going over some of the key benefits that we have for Python before we actually get into Flask. We're going to look at some of the frameworks that are available for Python for the purpose of web development. Then we're going to go over why Flask is something that we could choose or consider as a web development framework in Python. So after that, we're going to just show you how to deploy a small website using Flask, just to show you how easy it is, and then MongoDB and some of the benefits of MongoDB, and then eventually going into the actual project, which is a login form where a user is authenticated and then logged into the website. So we're just going to implement a subsection of that project in our hands-on here today. So let us go over some of the key benefits for Python. So as some of you already may know, Python is a very easy language to learn. Even if you're coming from a non-technical background, you will require a couple of weeks of training just to get started with Python, and then it's pretty easy from then on if you just keep practicing. So it's a very easy syntax to understand. It's very user-friendly in syntax. So that's why it's very easy to learn. And just because it's easy to learn, it also increases the productivity. So say for a simple mathematical equation, you might have to write like 6-7 lines of code in Java, but in Python, you can simply write one line of code in Python, and you can simply be done with that prospect altogether. So obviously, because of the increased speed in your coding, it will also increase your productivity. And then Python is an interpreted language, so that means it compiles the code line by line. So basically that means that so if there is an issue, it will basically wait until that line is resolved. So that is why it's an interpreted language. It's free and open source, so there is no licensing fees attached with Python, and it's open source. So you can basically look into the code base for Python itself and try to make some modifications or improvements on your own as well, tune it according to your needs. And then obviously at the end of it, there are abundant libraries. So every prospect imaginable, every use case imaginable for a coding language, Python already has a library for that. So a lot of libraries already there. So no need for immense amounts of coding just to get a particular use case done. And then eventually, just as I was saying earlier on, there are a lot of use cases for the libraries that Python has. So one of the use cases is web development. So as we can see on the screen, there are some frameworks that are mentioned. These are some of the many frameworks that are there for web development in Python. So there are some full stack frameworks like Django, TurboGears, and Web2Py. So these frameworks implement both in the front end and the back end. And there are some lightweight frameworks as well, like Python Flask and Python Bottle. So these are some of the frameworks that are used for lightweight tasks for minor server deployments, where a lot of complex things are not really involved, but you just need to implement a website anyway. So you would use some lightweight services for that, lightweight libraries for that. So Flask is one of those. So talking about Flask, we can now really get into how Flask is actually working. So as we can see, Flask is a lightweight WSGI, web application framework. It is designed to make getting started with web development quick and easy. So you can scale up no matter the complexity of the application that you may have. You can scale it up using Flask easily. So it's basically an abstraction from the complex intricacies involved in web development. So even a beginner can get into Flask and implement his own web application. As we can see on the bottom of the screen as well, as we saw above, that it is a WSGI application framework. So what does that mean? So basically, there are versions of WSGI in Python. So all of the web frameworks that are present and available in Python, they are compliant with WSGI. So it's a simple calling convention for web servers to forward requests to web applications or frameworks that are written in the Python programming language. So it is valid for a plethora of Python programming languages, the frameworks that are available like Flask and other frameworks as well. So what are the advantages of Flask and why should we use it? So other than the fact that it's easy to understand, and if you want to basically have an abstract view of getting into web development and easy server deployment, you can get into Flask. So the other features would include a built-in development server and fast debugger. So while you're developing your code, you can look at how it's functioning live, and there's a debugger also involved, so you can look at all the errors that are being accumulated in the development phase and resolve it in the moment itself. There's RESTful request dispatching, so all of the post methods, all of the get methods, the standard norms that are followed for requests and responses are followed in Flask as well. There are methods for those to be implemented. There is support for secure cookies. It's Unicode based, so it's the encoding character encoding standard is uniform, and it's basically acceptable by all web browsers and devices. It's WSGI 1.0 compliant. So the current version of WSGI is 1.0.1. If anything is 1.0 compliant, it basically works for later versions as well. And it's easy templating is available for Flask. So that means that mathematical functions and other functions as well, there are templates that are already available in Flask that help you to implement these without actually having to write the entirety of the code for that. And there's integrated support for unit testing, so you don't need to install any third-party application for unit testing, as Flask provides integrated support for that, so you can test using the methods available in Flask itself. So these are some of the advantages that Flask has and why you could choose it as your platform for web development. So if we look at the syntax that is provided for Flask, we can see that there are minimum lines of code involved. So you can basically deploy a web server with the absolute minimum lines of code possible. So if you were doing this using Node.js or Express.js, or if you were doing this any other framework, you would have to write a lot of lines of code basically to deploy your server. But with Flask, you can simply create a variable that, as we can see in the screen, we've created a variable called app. We've equated it to a new Flask app. So that is all basically that we have to do in order to basically create an application, a Flask application, and then we can simply run that application to deploy our server. So these are some of the things that make Flask a very lightweight language from a coding point of view, where you don't need a lot of developmental skills to actually get ahead in that particular domain. So we'll look more into the syntax during our hands-on section as well, but that was just to give you an idea about how easy it is to get started with Flask in the first place. So let's look at how easy it is to actually deploy a website by a little bit of hands-on. So I'll just show you that. So as we were discussing earlier on, we're now going to get into how easy it actually is to deploy a website using Flask. So without any further ado, let us just create a folder within this. We call this folder, we call this templates, right? Because we're going to be needing a template HTML, and we're simply going to open up a terminal right over here, right? So you can open that up, and the first thing that we need to do is actually install the dependency that is required, that is Flask itself. So simply type in pip install Flask and it will do everything for you. So as we can see, a Flask is already installed on my end, but if you do it for the first time, then it will install on your system as well. So let us simply create a Python file. So I'll simply click on new file and I'll call this web server .py. So that .py is a Python extension. Once you do that, Python file will be created. So for this purpose, for the rendering of an HTML page, all you need to do is import certain package, certain module from Flask. So we need Flask out of that and render template. So these are two modules that we require out of Flask. So I forgot to add the from over there. So this is what we will be needing in order to just deploy a simple HTML page onto a Flask server. So after we've done that, so let us now create a HTML file for us to render. So simply click on the templates folder, and within the templates folder, right click on it and create a new HTML file. We will call this file sample.html. Expand that. After you've expanded it, you can simply type in a simple HTML tag. So let us just create it, an h1 tag, and within that h1 tag you can write this is a sample website and save that. So we've now created our dummy HTML file. So we need to now render it. So simply open up your web server Python file and name your app something. So I'll name this as the same name as the Python file that it is located inside. So for that, simply call in Flask and name. So after we've called that, we've now successfully created our Flask application. So we now need some routing, right? So the default page for any website is the index page. So we will just simply do that. So we'll create a function for us to load the index page. So app.route. And within this, simply given the directory. So if the index page is the default page for your website, you simply give in a single slash. And then you create the function that you need to create. So def index. Open that up. And within that, after giving some indentation, you can now give in your return render template and given the name of the web page that you want to load in. So sample.html. And now we can simply call this function and be done with actually hosting our website on a local server at least. So the first thing that we will check is if the name is equivalent to main. And if that is true, which means that the code that we are about to run is the actual driver code for this program. If that is true, simply create some secret key for your app. So this is for encryption purposes. Not a bracket over there, just a string value, a random string value. We can call this secretive key. And then you can simply call in the function that actually deploys the app. So app.run. And we'll just turn on debugging as true. And that should be it. So you simply save that Python file. And let us now deploy this. So type in Python. And the name of the new file, which is web_server.py. So there's an issue. Oh, we didn't actually use double equals to over here. So that was the error that we had. So now that is resolved. So we shouldn't be facing any more errors now. Let's enter, and that would deploy the website onto this particular address. So let us now check that. So once you have actually opened up the address that was mentioned in the command line terminal, so you'll get something like this. So the HTML page that we created has now been rendered, and all of that was done using minimalistic lines of code and a pretty convenient and abstract server deployment at that. So this is one of the advantages that you get with using Flask as opposed to basic Node.js or any other web development framework. So since we're going to be creating a login form, we also need to be storing some information, right? So we need to store the username of the individual who tries to log into the website. And we need the password for that username for the person who's trying to log in. So these two things, they cannot be stored temporarily. We need to create a database in order for us to store that information, right? So what are we going to use? We're going to be using MongoDB. So MongoDB is a cross-platform document-oriented database program. So a lot of complex words. So it basically means that there are JSON-like objects that MongoDB uses as its data tuples. So say the traditional way of implementing databases is SQL formatting. So SQL has tables. Tables have columns, and those columns have their respective values in the column, and the rows are called tuples. So that is how SQL works. So, but the thing about SQL is you need to have these tables already created. But a lot of times what will happen is, say, if you're working with a web application, you might not know the actual format of the data that is being sent by this website. So you cannot preemptively create a table, right? So the static table creation is not possible all of the times and in all of the use cases. So there is a solution for that, and that solution is MongoDB, right? So MongoDB is basically a NoSQL database program. So as it says in the name, it's a NoSQL database program. So it's not dependent on SQL being a factor for it to store data. So what you can do now is create your databases and create your tables on the go, or what we would call as equivalent of tables on the go, right? So what the data as it comes, as it registers into the database, it will basically create the collections that are corresponding to that data by itself, by assessing how the data looks. So that is one of the advantages of MongoDB. And other advantages would include that it's schema-less, right? So SQL tables do not need to be implemented. So that way you can basically create new columns, new tuples very easily, dynamically. So dynamic database and table creation is also one of the advantages. And that also makes it easily scalable, since you don't actually have to preemptively create a new table or a new table format for storing new categories of data. If, say, a new feature comes up that you need to classify as well, then in an SQL table you would have had to create another column. But in MongoDB, that new attribute, whenever it comes in, the column, or say the collection for it, will already create itself as the data is coming in. So the data is also in the form of objects. So the distinction that you can create between an SQL table or and a JSON object would be that JSON objects are very easily readable by object-oriented programming languages such as Python, and SQL tables, the data that is returned by SQL tables, unless converted into a JSON format, they basically aren't that well read. They aren't that well interpretable by object-oriented programming languages. So these are some of the advantages that you get with MongoDB. Right. So let us now get into the project that we have, which is the login form. So the libraries that we're going to be using are very few and essential to our project here today, because the first library that we are using is Flask for our Flask purposes. And the second library that we're using is Flask PyMongo, which is the connector between a Flask framework and the MongoDB database, right? So without any further ado, let's get into the project. So let us now create an actual login page with some backend functionality as well using Flask. So before we actually begin, there are already 3 HTML files that I have created for this specific purpose with the post function already there. So you can simply download these sample HTML files from anywhere basically and use their post functions for your implementations as well. We're not going to be focusing too much on HTML in this session. So the resources that are required for this particular front end have already been imported into our project beforehand. So we'll close those up because we wouldn't be dealing with them in this project. We'll only be using these names that you can see, the index, the layout, and the register page that would be required if you're creating your account on the login page for the first time. So we'll close those up. And as you can see in my Python file, I have the URL for my MongoDB server. So you can create your MongoDB server anywhere that you would like and copy your URL from there and use it for your database purposes in whatever Flask project you do. So we're going to be using Flask PyMongo for this because Flask PyMongo is the intertwining element that is required for us to connect our Flask server with our database, our MongoDB database. So that is what we're going to be doing. So firstly, like before, simply import your Flask elements that are required. So we will read Flask. We'll obviously need render template because we will be rendering the web pages. And then we need the URL for, because we're going to be using the URL implementation in order for us to jump from web page to web page. We'll need the request. We'll need the session. And we need the redirect. So all of these things are already implemented in Flask. So you don't need to write specific code for it. So one of the key advantages again. Then we need our connector, that is connecting our Flask with our backend database. So Flask underscore PyMongo is what we're going to be using. And we're going to be importing PyMongo from that. So our connector has now been imported. And another thing that we can implement, this is optional. So if you're trying it for the first time, you may not need to implement it, but say if you want to encrypt the password, so you can use simple bcrypt for that. So I'm going to be using bcrypt. You'll also need to install bcrypt as well, because it doesn't come installed by default. So like before, let us create the app. Now we need to create the functions that basically bounce us around from web page to web page and implement their functionalities. So first thing is obviously for our index page, app.route. Actually, we'll first need to initialize the backend database. So that is easily done using the app.config. So the .config element for our app. So there is already an element in the configuration which is called as MongoDB name. So we can specify the database that we are going to be using. And in our case, it's Intellipaat. And in the second config, we're going to be giving the location, the URL basically for our MongoDB database server. So you give the URL. And then we simply copy this location that we got from our database and we paste it within the single quotes. Right. So some things you would need to replace in it. So for instance, the password for this particular server that I have temporarily created, the database server, the password is pymongo 1. And the database name is obviously, as we saw before, Intellipaat. So we've now successfully given in our URI as well. So the first thing that we need to do is initialize our connector. So you do that by simply assigning a variable to it. So pymongo, and given the application as an app that we've just initialized with the server location, the database location, and the database name. So the first thing that you will do is create the route for your index. So I'll do this really quick. So we're going to give a condition here. So we're first going to check if there's a particular username. These are the elements that we're going to be adding in our database as well, is in session. Then we're going to return them a message that if they've logged into the website successfully, if they've successfully logged into the login page, then they'll get a message which is basically returning the string. And then we can simply give in the string value of what their actual username is. So this would be picked up from the session object and the username within that session object. And other than that, it's a simple return statement with the render template that we discussed in the website deployment tutorial as well. So in our case, the HTML page that we are trying to access is the default HTML page or the index HTML page. So we're going to name it index instead of sample. Then we're going to press enter and move on to our next routing function as well. So the other page that we're dealing with is the login page. So let us create a route for that. And we'll call this login. And the methods that this particular route is going to be implementing is the post method. So whenever somebody logs in, they're going to actually call the post method and given the details that they've used to log in as. And then let us create the function. So we're just first going to call all the users that are present in our database to check whether the user that we are requiring to log in is actually there or not. So we first store it inside users, and the function call is MongoDB dot users, which is the collection that we've created for users in our database. And the actual user that we're currently as. So we'll first check for that. By using a search function, which is find_1, and checking if the name matches any of the names that are present in our database. So we're going to pick the sum from the request form, which is the web page that we entered it in. So after we've done that, we can now give the appropriate actions for each of the cases if the user has logged in successfully with the right credentials or if he's unable to log in. So for the first case, which is if the login has been successful and this function has returned a true value, we're then going to match the password if the password is correct or not. So the algorithm that we're using, and this is optional, you can use a simple string value as well. You don't need to actually use an encryption algorithm, but it's basically what the norm is for password. So we're using bcrypt. And then we're going to match both of the passwords that are there. So the encrypted password that is present within our database and the password that the user sent, we're going to encrypt it and match it if with the password that is present within our database, so that we are actually authenticating our user. We're going to encode this to UTF. So you wouldn't actually need to do all of this if you're simply using a string value for passwords. So if you're doing it for the first time, it's highly recommended that you go that way rather than memorizing the bcrypt jargon. Then we're going to encode this as well in the UTF-8 format. And then we're going to match it. With the password in our database. For that particular user. So if this condition is true and the passwords actually match, you're actually going to put this username into session as well. So what we're doing right now is simply adding the new username that has just logged in with a successful authentication ID into our session additionally. And then after this successful login has occurred, we can simply redirect them to the index page and give them the message that they are logged in as whatever user they have logged in as. So redirect is a function that is already provided to us by Flask for that purpose only. And we can simply give in the location for that as well. And if this return statement does not happen, which means that the password did not match or the login user was not successful, that it wasn't true, the username did not exist. So we can simply give in another return statement that happens as a fail-safe, which basically means that the user did not exist or if the password is wrong, and return another statement and give them the query, the string output that there was an invalid username and password, or not and necessarily, or password combination. So once you've actually done that, you can now create a page for registration as well. So we can now create a page for if our users want to register into our website. So we can simply do that. And we can call this /register for that. And the methods that this would have is post and get as well, because we also have to check and input both at the same time. So we have to check for if the user already exists, and we're just we're not simply overwriting that registration, and the input would be for the get. So if we're actually changing something in the record, so if we're adding something in the record, we need both of these functions for that. Call this register. So we're first going to check which method has been called for. So if it's post, we're going to first take in all of the users that are actually present within our database so that there is no overlap. And we're going to simply store in a Boolean value whether that user exists or not. By using the find one function. So if there is no existing user, which means that the user name that has been entered in the registration form is unique and new, Then we will simply add that entry into our collection. So first thing that we would do is actually take in the password that has been input by the user and encrypting it. We'll encode this into UTF again. And then we'll simply insert the new user into our database. So the insert function is there for that, present in the PyMongo connector. And we're going to add another criteria for this, which is the password. So the password would be the encrypted version of the plain text password entered by the user. And this would be equivalent to hash pass. And then we're going to log in the new user who has just created his account. By simply adding him into the current session. So it would be square brackets here, not round brackets. And then after that is done, obviously we'll redirect this user who has just created this account onto the index page. So simply use the same statement as here. And those are essentially all of the functions that we would be using for a simple login implement. And now that that has been done and all of the fail safes have been addressed, we can simply deploy the website. So the same steps as before. So if the name is equivalent to main, we can give some secret key to our app. So we'll call this secretive key again, or why not? And we'll simply run the app. Save this up and this should run without any issues. So there seems to be an error. Okay, so there's an extra bracket over here which wasn't required. So that should probably fix it. Yeah, so that probably fixes it. And now we can simply open up our terminal and run our Python program. So for that, simply type in Python space and the website name. Yeah, so that basically starts our website. So there are certain packages that may not be installed on your end. So If you want to install the connector, which is the PyMongo connector for Flask, you can simply type in pip install, and you can give in the name, which is Flask hyphen PyMongo, and this would install the connector that you require. So the requirement is already satisfied on my end, but if you're installing it for the first time, it will probably download for you. So that would basically resolve this import. And if you want to use bcrypt, because bcrypt is optional, you can use simple string as well if you're doing it for the first time, just to understand the concept of how it works. So if you want to use bcrypt, you can install bcrypt as well with a similar statement. So that would be that. So the requirement for bcrypt is already satisfied on my end. And there's two things more that we need to add, which is the error message in the event of the username already existing. So we'll return a string which says username already in database. And the simple rendering of the page, which would be under the render template, register.html. So we do that and we save it. Let us now test the deployed website that we have created for our login. So let us try with a random username. So we'll call this Intellipaat 1, and the password could be anything, 123, and click on login. So as we can see, since there wasn't any username and password with that combination, it gave us invalid username password combination. And if we simply go back and try it again and register Intellipaat 1, and given the password that we want to register it with, so as we can see, we are now logged in as Intellipaat. So with that out of the way, we are at the end of our session here today. If you would like, you could go head over to intellipaat.com and use the coupon code YouTube30 to get a flat 30% discount on all of courses. So it's especially for our YouTube audiences who are watching us here today, you can go to intellipaat.com and use the coupon code YouTube30 for that. And that is it from us. And if you want to contact our sales team to know anything about our courses, you can use the following contact details presented on your screen here today. And if you would like to know more about our courses or your potential career paths, you can contact our course advisors with the following contact details as well. So be sure to sign up for the webinar to keep updated with our new endeavors and new videos. And if you would like to ask us doubts personally, then also you can simply sign up for our webinar. So the link for the webinar has been provided to you in the YouTube chat box. Be sure you sign up for it and catch up with us in our next webinar. So that is about it from us. Thank you for attending this session, and goodbye.